Sometimes, nothing felt like enough. The images conjured in her dreams felt like nothing more than that. The dreams of an imaginative girl. It was a push and pull, or she'd slip away before being drawn back in. But the withdrawals were dark and painful, hopeless. This happened each time a monotonous reality set in. The magic Darcy once held would fall through her fingertips like melted gold, gathering in a diluted puddle at her feet. And ever the queen of metaphors, it became a form of coping, to envision herself as a building, old and crumbling, with dark rooms and cold hallways. Yet no one was allowed in. Not the one who built it, nor the one who abandoned it, leaving it to be destroyed. Welcome to Mirrors, a collection of horrors, history, and hauntings. I'm your host, Gabby. Last week, we went to Eastern State Penitentiary, which was Pennsylvania's attempt to reform the prison system. Alongside the creation and early years of Eastern State, Pennsylvania began asking where else changes could be made. This was also at a time in history when the government was gaining a larger role in industrialization, healthcare, and other aspects of public life. Today, we explore another example of those changes, the Harrisburg State Hospital. I've driven Cameron Street many times in my life. However, it wasn't until recent years that I turned up the winding road to the top of a hill overlooking the city of Harrisburg. This road weaves between abandoned buildings and houses, which once made up the campus of the Harrisburg State Hospital. My first time taking this road, I remember thinking, what is this? Each structure looked so different, yet was shrouded in the same sense of mystery. Researching Harrisburg State, I've learned that this is known to be one of the most haunted places in Pennsylvania. A few of the buildings have been transformed into office spaces for various government agencies. And there's also new no trespassing signs up, signaling more changes happening soon. A few paranormal groups and tours have been allowed into the buildings over the years as well, although they're all closed to the public now. But that doesn't mean these buildings are empty. At an undisclosed point in time, I visited the campus, walking between the buildings and looking into the windows. Even the abandoned ones are filled with furniture and hospital equipment, appearing as they would have when the hospital was open. Lavish curtains hang in the windows, at least the ones that aren't broken or boarded up. Desks are stacked with papers and files. The long hallways are lit, the doors open as though they're inviting visitors in. And many people, most being the employees that work in the buildings today, are witness to the fact that some patients have never left.
I've always been really interested in the windows here. I don't know what it is, but they're just like, I feel like I can see faces in them. Like, this is an interesting recording location because I actually can't go in here, and I've bothered the state of Pennsylvania enough asking for special access. But there are no trespassing signs everywhere. This building is off limits. Can only really look at it from the outside, but I think that kind of adds to the air of secrecy around all the stories of this place.
Harrisburg State Hospital was a facility for those facing mental illnesses. The hospital emerged from a shift in how medical professionals were viewing and treating mental health, no longer excusing mental illness as the wrath of God. A new approach called moral treatment was adopted. Philip Thomas's book, Harrisburg State Hospital, Pennsylvania's first public asylum, which I'll be referencing throughout this episode, describes moral treatment as simply viewing and treating the mentally ill less as an uncontrollable animal and more as a person with an illness. It goes without saying that mental illnesses were deeply misunderstood. They still are in many ways. This is the history from which modern stigmas have evolved. Up until the founding of Harrisburg State Hospital, it was far too common that mentally ill individuals would be hidden away in their homes, separated not just from the outside world, but from their own family. They'd be locked in attics and basements or abandoned entirely, left to roam aimlessly. There were poorhouses and private hospitals, although they were inaccessible to those who couldn't afford to go there. Even then, there weren't any treatments or effective methods of care. The story of Harrisburg State Hospital really starts with Dr. Benjamin Rush, who was known as the father of American psychiatry. He was also a politically active figure during the American Revolution, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, and the treasurer of the Mint. He worked on the staff at the Pennsylvania Hospital in Philadelphia and eventually centered his practice around mental illness. In 1812, he published the first textbook on mental illnesses in the United States, titled Medical Inquiries and Observations upon the Diseases of the Mind. Rush advocated for a treatment called the tranquilizing chair, which was an alternative to straitjackets. Patients would be put in a chair, and their head and limbs would be confined. This reduced blood flow to the brain. Rush thought that mental illness was the result of inflammation in the brain, so this was his solution. He also believed in bleeding and purging to cure diseases, and it's said he cured himself and a friend of yellow fever by making themselves bleed. These treatments are clearly far from what we'd consider effective or even humane today, but at the time, they were progressive. Most importantly, they were treatments. Dr. Benjamin Rush established the concept that mental illnesses could be diagnosed and treated. These people weren't possessed by the devil, and they certainly didn't deserve to just be shoved to the side. That shift alone improved living conditions for patients at hospitals. The physical formation of Harrisburg State is largely credited to a woman named Dorothea Dix. Dorothea was a teacher who worked in a Sunday school class for female inmates at East Cambridge Jail. There, she witnessed the realities of the deeply flawed prison system, as well as the awful conditions that those with mental illnesses were placed in. The mentally ill were jailed alongside violent criminals. Dorothea was inspired to create change, and she traveled around the United States and Europe, inspecting jails and poorhouses. She'd put together a memorial detailing her observations, which would then be presented to state legislatures. Dorothea Dix played a critical role in founding 32 hospitals and 15 schools, including the Harrisburg State Hospital. The state of Pennsylvania appointed a group of men to select a plot of land and begin the construction of a public asylum. Their parameters were: the land must be no less than 100 acres, it must be within 10 miles of Harrisburg, and it must cost less than $10,000. Once they found suitable land, they visited the Pennsylvania Hospital, where they were given a detailed tour by the superintendent, Dr. Thomas Kirkbride. This was in 1845. By this time, the PA hospital had established a new facility specifically for patients facing mental illnesses, although it was still a private institution. After this visit, the men were inspired to adopt the Kirkbride design. This was used by other institutions such as the Trans-Allegheny Lunatic Asylum, which is also very haunted. Their official website defines the design as long, rambling wings that provided therapeutic sunlight and air to comfortable living quarters. It took years to develop the legislation behind the hospital, as well as to physically construct it. On June 19, 1851, the building was completed. The next few months were spent furnishing the space and getting it ready for patients. It was opened October 1st of that year, under the name the Pennsylvania State Lunatic Hospital. Patients were to be accepted at the expense of the counties where they lived. 5 days after its opening, a 42-year-old woman named Elizabeth was admitted as the first patient. Elizabeth had lost 2 of her 3 sons to scarlet fever and was diagnosed with melancholy and dyspepsia, which caused abdominal discomfort and digestive issues. Elizabeth, like other early patients, was primarily treated through occupational therapy. It was believed that nutritious foods, natural light, fresh air, and keeping the mind busy was the best treatment. They spent time outside, worked on campus, engaged with hospital groups and activities, and ate family-style meals. At first, the hospital was only one building, the main building. The wards were pretty much identical with those long hallways consistent with the Kirkbride design. However, because of how the main building was constructed, the hallways were much narrower and darker than they were intended to be, which was just one of the many early problems faced here. The windows had been fit improperly, so there were issues with heating and ventilation, and the building quickly became overcrowded. 2 buildings, called the Brand buildings, were constructed, and they were connected to the main building by above-ground corridors. Even with these new buildings to house patients, overcrowding was still an issue. Patients ended up in rooms with beds lined up along the walls and in the center of the room, side by side and facing one another, which obviously made privacy impossible. These issues led to the main building being torn down and a new administration building being built, which is the building that sits atop the hill today. There was also a shift to a cottage plan style, which meant there would be a variety of small buildings rather than trying to keep everything in one place. Buildings were designed to separate patients based on gender and specific diagnosis. It's important to note that overcrowding remained an issue, though. Throughout its history, Harrisburg State Hospital seemed to be forever changing. As new buildings were constructed, old ones would be abandoned and torn down. Perhaps this constant movement has facilitated a concentrated energy across the hospital's campus. Philip Thomas's book includes a collection of photographs offering glimpses into life at the hospital over the years. They show patients and staff painting, riding horses, participating in the hospital orchestra, playing baseball, walking dogs, playing pool, cooking, or working in the various factories and shops on campus. Dorothea Dix remained an active presence in the hospital as well, raising money to provide patients with recreation spaces such as a bowling alley, as well as books, musical instruments, and animals. Harrisburg State Hospital would eventually be coined the City on the Hill because it truly was self-sufficient. That's because working and supporting the hospital's daily function was part of the treatment plan. The campus had pretty much everything you could think of. Farms, a bake shop, dentist's office, power plant, laundry building, chapel, even its own fire department. That doesn't mean, though, that patients were confined to the hospital. They'd be taken into Harrisburg for activities, or even offered weekend passes to be out on their own accord. Because this place had everything one would need for their daily life, it captured every aspect of life during that time in history. During the Civil War, Harrisburg State provided medical supplies and food to Camp Curtin, a nearby Union Army training camp. It's documented that soldiers would even come to the hospital to receive care, adding a whole new element to the potential hauntings here. One building that stood out to me most while exploring the campus was the tuberculosis ward. Tuberculosis is an infectious disease of the lung that didn't really have a treatment back then. Patients were just left by large open windows, thinking the fresh air could help them. In the early 1900s, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the United States. Think of Elizabeth, the first patient at Harrisburg. Think of her grief, the weight of what she felt. Harrisburg is haunted because of individual stories like hers. But there are also places on campus like the tuberculosis ward, where there was a concentration of death and illness. The term City on the Hill also goes to show that this place was huge, and it was continuing to expand, which, of course, meant there were developments in the forms of treatment being used as well. The historical information I was able to find about Harrisburg State denies any abuse towards patients, which was far too common at similar establishments. The influential people behind the hospital's founding, as well as the administration and staff, seemed to come from a place of genuine care and an understanding for how desperately change was needed in the mental health space. However, as we delve into the types of treatments, I want to acknowledge that being a patient here was likely a traumatic experience. Overcrowding made neglect pretty much inevitable, and it was impossible for each patient to have their needs met. The history also seems to be not as documented, or at least not as accessible as other institutions I've researched. I'm not saying that means anything is being hidden. It's entirely plausible that old documents and abandoned buildings were stolen or destroyed. I just want to clarify that bad things did happen here, not just as a basis for the potential hauntings, but to give context for how mental health was treated at this point in time. There was hydrotherapy treatment, which looked different throughout the years. One method was the rain bath, in which a patient would be sprayed with various nozzles and water pressures. Another was the wet pack, where a patient would be wrapped in wet sheets, which would constrict their movements as they dried. This supposedly calmed anxiety. In the 40s, Harrisburg started using electroshock therapy on patients with depression. Interestingly, when exploring the campus, I ran into a man who said he was a nursing student at the hospital. He was driving by when I was standing in front of the administration building. Just as a note, I did get permission to use his voice, so I did change it for privacy.
That's creepy, right?
Yeah.
Kind of cool though.
I was here as a nursing student back in the day. When
Really?
It was still active. That was 40 years ago.
Wow.
That is awesome.
But yeah, it was strange. It was strange.
I bet.
You know, it was sad. I'll say that.
I ran into him again later, watching as he stood amongst the buildings in wonder, seeing him relive those memories. He told me about his part in electroshock therapy.
It's interesting to look at this building. You walk around. These two down here seem to be older buildings. If you look in, you can see down the hall.
Oh.
How the doors kind of were opened into various, probably communal rooms. I don't remember this building. I was in this building doing work. And even like later, I became an anesthetist, put folks to sleep for their surgeries later. This was as a nursing student I was here, but I remember giving anesthetics in here for electroconvulsive therapy.
Wow.
It's like they use it for severe depression. It kind of wipes out their memory and they're not depressed anymore, which sounds weird, but it worked.
In the 50s, insulin shock therapy was used. Patients would be injected over and over again with insulin to put them in a near comatose state. This was used primarily on those with schizophrenia. Insulin therapy was eventually replaced by neuroleptic drugs in the 60s. And there was the lobotomy, an infamous treatment that severed connections in the brain's frontal cortex. There were various methods of performing lobotomies, although the most well-known was the transorbital lobotomy. Patients would have a pick-like instrument forced behind their eye to put a hole in their skull and access the brain. Thomas's book claims lobotomies were looked down upon by Harrisburg's administration, although I'm sure they still occurred there. The book also says that if patients were to undergo a lobotomy, it was preferred they were sent to Philadelphia or Washington, D.C. Lobotomies were used to treat schizophrenia, depression, bipolar disorder, and more. Most patients lobotomized in psychiatric facilities were women, and there are cases of people being lobotomized without their knowledge. Lobotomies had the potential to cause damaging or even deadly complications, such as hemorrhaging, epilepsy, and dementia, and they often left people with a severe lack of emotion. Expansion of the hospital also meant more patients, which led to more overcrowding. This paralleled a decrease in staff as many male employees were drafted during World War II. Thomas says the crowded conditions at the hospital existed because of the unfortunate way it was used by the outside world. It got to the point where people were being sent here not because they were in need of treatment, but because they were unwanted in their community. These unwanted individuals were homeless, people who struggled with drug and alcohol use, or even elderly. Harrisburg adopted open wards in the mid-50s. All doors were left unlocked, and each ward only had one nurse. Patients were able to spend more time outside because they could leave on their own terms. These open wards allowed more freedom, but they also added to the chaos that kept people from getting the help and attention they needed from nurses. There was also likely more opportunities for abuses. This was the beginning of the end for Harrisburg State Hospital. In 1972, an Alabama federal court ruling would spark further developments in the mental health space, while drastically changing patient lives at hospitals like Harrisburg State. Wyatt v. Stickney said that a young man at the Bryce Hospital in Tuscaloosa was not being given quality care and was not in a safe space, physically or psychologically. The case also established a patient's Bill of Rights, which put restrictions on things like patient-to-staff ratio, patient nutrition, and how often bed sheets were changed. The reason this impacted Harrisburg so much was it also stated no patient shall be required to perform labor which involve the operation and maintenance of the hospital. While these changes are positive, I'm sure as a patient it was hard to have such a dramatic change to not just your treatment plan, but to your established daily routine. Like the ever-changing campus, life at Harrisburg was constantly changing. Throughout the late 1900s and early 2000s, new psychiatric medications became available and less people were being referred to state hospitals. Those with mental illnesses were instead staying with their families or just living independently. Patients who still were going to Harrisburg were staying for shorter times, with the average being 6 months within the last few years it was open. Because of this shift in care, as well as Pennsylvania's decreased spending on mental health, the hospital was officially closed in January 2006. And ever since, it has become the site of intense poltergeist activity, which is defined as loud, disruptive noises and physical objects being moved inexplicably. People have heard screams, disembodied footsteps, or seen shadow figures and full-on apparitions. The first cemetery was moved in 1927 during renovations, meaning the 230 bodies interred there had to be exhumed, and it's not exactly clear where they ended up. This disruption could have caused some of the unrest on campus. But Harrisburg's hauntings are mainly attributed to the treatments, and the fact that patients probably felt like experiments as treatments developed over time. The Eaton building housed the violently insane. Male and female patients were in this building, although they were separated and housed on different sides. This building also had a few of the hydrotherapy rooms. In 2021, the show Ghost Nation filmed an investigation at the hospital. They interviewed an employee who worked in an office in the Eaton building. She claimed to have heard footsteps approaching her office door, and she'd seen a shadowy figure that disappeared into the wall. Government agency employees also had horrifying encounters in the Cherrywood building, which had also been converted to offices. Cherrywood was once used as a female ward for the criminally insane. One woman described watching the elevator open and close on its own. And she discussed one particular night when two of her coworkers witnessed the elevator open. A gurney rolled out of the elevator, a woman in a patient gown sitting on it. Cherrywood patients were known for being the most violent. However, they likely also felt the most misunderstood and isolated. Early in the hospital's history, 8 criminals were sent from Eastern State Penitentiary. 4 actually escaped, And this whole situation showed that Harrisburg really had no idea how to care for and treat these individuals. Another paranormal hotspot is the morgue, where bloodstains have spontaneously appeared on the floor. There was a pathology lab in the morgue where, with the consent of patients' families, brains were examined and studied after patient deaths. This was a part of researching mental illness at Harrisburg, but I can imagine it would make the patients feel like experiments once more, even beyond their death. Since its abandonment, there have been many break-in attempts to the morgue, and while the hospital was open, it was actually set on fire by a patient. The morgue still stands, and all of this and more has facilitated a strong, unexplainable energy in the building. Out of all the times I'd explored the campus, I'd never seen the morgue. During my last visit, as I was leaving, I drove around a small circular part of the road just to turn around, and I looked up to see the morgue was directly in front of me. That's when I realized that I probably had been by it before, but it was obvious how I could have missed it. The building itself had an incredibly eerie feel to it, although maybe that was just because I knew it was the morgue. But with the boarded up windows and the way it was hidden back in the overgrowth, it really did take my breath away. The trees seemed to embrace the edges of the building, and they hung down the front of it. Ghost Nation covered the story of a patient named Henry Miller, who, on one of his visits home, stabbed his mother to death. He went to the police, confessing to another murder, which actually occurred at the hospital. Miller had murdered his fellow patient, Beverly Rhines, 2 weeks prior to killing his mother, and left her body, covered in leaves, next to the morgue. Sadly, no one had yet found her, or even noticed that she was gone. All of these stories, and all of the structures across this vast campus, are connected physically by a network of tunnels. During the hospital's operation, the tunnels were crucial to daily function, as they were used for the transportation of food and material goods, to move patients, to get between buildings, and to take the deceased to the morgue. This constant flow of movement has not yet stopped, with shadow figures seen frequently in the tunnels by maintenance workers. A 2010 episode of Ghost Lab caught 2 EVPs in the tunnels, saying Peter and Annie. On the exact day I started writing this episode, I was devastated to hear the news that most of the buildings at Harrisburg State Hospital are being torn down early next year. I don't think the ghosts will be too happy about that either. This place captured such a transformative time in the mental health space. Nothing can take that away, but it will be hard to see that landscape change once again. A few buildings, such as the main administration building and the chapel, are set to remain and be renovated. This entire campus is so fascinating, though, and actually quite beautiful, even in its abandoned state. And I wish it was going to be preserved. I want to shout out the Facebook page Harrisburg State Hospital Stories, where the creator is compiling historical documents and personal stories to make sure the history of Harrisburg State lives on. I've linked the page under the sources section in the show notes. I know I have a lot of Pennsylvania residents listening, so please, if you or anyone you know has any stories about the hospital or photographs of it, now is the time to share them. You can post them on the Facebook page I mentioned, or send them to me at mirrorspod@gmail.com. I'd love to hear from you. I haven't really talked about it on this podcast yet, but I am deeply passionate about mental health awareness. My own struggle with anxiety and depression is a huge part of why I am a writer and creative. Telling stories, especially stories that lean into the dark and mysterious, is a really good outlet for me and helps me feel more connected to myself. Learning about Harrisburg State Hospital has been a passion project for me over the last few years. It's just a bonus that it's really freaking haunted. I'm really grateful to now have this space to bring together everything I've learned and tell the story of a place that will soon be demolished. I'll leave you with another cool fact about Harrisburg State Hospital, which I, as a film nerd, was so excited to learn about. The 1999 film Girl Interrupted, starring Angelina Jolie and Winona Ryder, was filmed at the hospital while it was still open. This was at the point that there weren't many patients there anymore. But yeah, Building 22 and the administration building are featured heavily in the movie. The administration sign that's still hanging today was actually a prop from the movie. I'll be watching it this week for our very first movie in the Patreon Movie Club. If you want to watch it too and share your thoughts, the Patreon link is in the show notes. Harrisburg State Hospital's history is extensive and so very important. The paranormal encounters here make it clear that that history is not going anywhere, and it will surely be interesting to see what happens when these buildings are torn down. Thank you so much for listening. Again, I'm your host, Gabby. I'll be back next week with another episode. Until then, stay spooky. This has been Mirrors, Horrors, History, and Hauntings, produced and hosted by Gabby Hope Frye. Check out the show's Instagram and TikTok at Mirrors Podcast to see pictures and videos from today's episode, as well as other paranormal content. Access bonus episodes and exclusive content by joining the Mirrors Patreon.